first in like 1983, so he's been there for a long time.
This part,
Cooper
right?
says Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street. Okay, so what he means by that is members go there, they learn how to raise money, they become focused obsessively on raising money. But one of the things that they're really focused on is how do they go from Capitol Hill to becoming a lobbyist? Because that's where the real money is. You know, a member of Congress gets paid about as much as the students I educate at the Harvard Law School in their first year as lawyers. You know, so to ordinary Americans, it's a lot of money, but to people on Capitol Hill, it doesn't seem like a lot of money. But then they go and become a lobbyist. They can make 10 times that as a lobbyist. And so what Cooper says is you have this institution which has become so focused on the money that it's just an institution for producing influence that can be sold. And first the congressmen are basically sucking up to the people who want to buy influence, and then the congressmen become the people buying influence themselves because they're working as lobbyists for these important interests.
Whew. So they're in the rigged game, they understand how it gets rigged, and then they work to rig it.
Yeah. Yeah, they see this as their business plan.
And it's their honeypot.
Yeah.
And there's, whatever the district is outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, where there's some ungodly number of wealthy people per capita, where there's more lobbyists in that area than anywhere else in the United States.
Right.
And that's this giant collection of wealth.
Right. Washington, D.C. is an incredibly prosperous place. And anybody who's been there, you know, who's seen it for a long time, like I clerked there in the early 1990s, and it was a pretty grungy place. But it's a really opulent city now. It's like the golden city on the hill, you know, the Oz. And the reason for that is the extraordinary amount of money that's been poured into that district for the purpose of buying influence to buy legislation that makes it so these incumbent dinosaur corporations that have protected themselves against competition across the country can continue to profit.
It's a weird place, though, because even though it's incredibly wealthy, it's also incredibly poor. There's a vast difference.
Picture of America.
Yeah, the spectrum is really wide. Because, I mean, that was when, in the 90s, that's the Marion Barry time, right? Yeah. So that was when, I mean, he won as mayor again when he came back after being arrested for smoking crack.
Yeah.
And people are like, whatever.
Yeah.
Little crack.
Yeah, it was an ugly place then. It's become, you know, a grotesque place now from the standpoint of the principles of what America is supposed to be. You know? Because the privileged there are not people who are privileged because they've, you know, Elon Musk-like invented a great new product, or they've worked incredibly hard in a competitive marketplace and succeeded. They're privileged because they've leveraged influence in a corrupt system to profit. And the people who are failing there, you know, a lot of reasons they're failing is just we don't have a competitive, powerful economy that gives them the opportunities right now, because that district, Washington, D.C., because it's got no effective representation, is one of the worst represented districts in the country.
So essentially this all started out with Newt Gingrich's group, and they decided to spend so much time concentrating on fundraising. And then once that became successful, everyone else followed suit?
Yeah, so the game became no longer how do we legislate for America, but how do we rally our troops to raise the money we need to win in the next election. The game is just about the election. I mean, you know, my mother lives in Hilton Head, which is, of course, a very Republican district. But they elected their first Democrat, Joe Cunningham. And Joe, my mother loved him and wanted to support him. My mother's a Republican, but here he was. She wanted to support a Democrat, so I sent a check on her behalf to this Democrat. The day he was elected, he started raising money for the next election. His whole focus from that moment on. And now he started a big membership organization. That's not worth that much, because you're only allowed to give a total of $5,400 to a candidate over the course of the life of his campaign. But what Citizens United said is that the Constitution protects the right of the corporation to engage in political speech independent of a political campaign. So if some congressman is running for Congress, Exxon Corporation can come in and spend $1 million to say why that congressman is a good congressman or why that congressman is a terrible congressman, but they have a constitutional right to do that. Now, when that happened, there were a bunch of us who were, chicken littles about this, who said, oh, this is the end of democracy, because these corporations are just going to spend unbelievable amounts of money in the political process, like spending their money to affect the results. And that was not correct. Because what happened is corporations quickly discovered the high price of free speech, right? So corporations like Target backed a anti-gay candidate for governor, and all of a sudden found their stores being picketed across the country because people were furious that they would be supporting such a candidate for governor. So corporations quickly found that it's not cheap to engage in political speech in the marketplace. They didn't want to do it like that. Instead, they wanted to find a way to channel their money into dark money organizations or into what evolved after Citizens United, something called super PACs. So super PACs were created not by the Supreme Court. Super PACs were created by a lower court that said, well, if you can spend unlimited amounts of money, you should be allowed to give unlimited amounts of money to an independent political action committee. That was the super PAC. Supreme Court has never ruled on that question. We have a case that we're taking up through Alaska that's trying to appeal to the Supreme Court to get them to actually decide whether super PACs are mandated by the Constitution. And what's different about this case is the argument we're making is to the conservatives. What we're saying is the framers of our Constitution were obsessed with corruption. That was the issue that they were overwhelmingly trying to avoid. And they weren't focused on bribery. They were focused on institutional corruption, these institutions that became unconnected to their purpose, representing Americans. And what our view is these conservatives on the Supreme Court, like, Neil Gorsuch or Justice Thomas or Brett Kavanaugh, who say that we interpret the Constitution the way the framers would have interpreted it. We're going to make the argument to them, which is there is no doubt the framers of the Constitution would have looked at these super PACs and said, these are an abomination. These are outrageous from the perspective of the democracy they were trying to create. And those justices should, at least one of them, be willing to stand up and defend the framers' values against this modern corruption. And if just one of them voted with the 4 liberals who've already said they think super PACs are an abomination, then we could have a way to end the super PACs in this system. And that would be an enormous benefit because they've become so powerful. But the courts alone can't save us. Even if you ended super PACs tomorrow, you still have Lesterland. Because the super PACs are not what I was talking about in Lesterland. When I was talking about Lesterland was giving to candidates directly. And the small number of people would still be giving to candidates directly. And the only way to solve that is for Congress to pass new laws that change the way campaigns get funded. That's the sort of thing H.R. 1 is trying to do. That's the sort of thing Rogan is trying to do. But that's the sort of thing that we don't have a president to support right now. We don't have Democratic presidential candidates who are making it the champion issue right now. And it won't get done unless they do.
Well, it seems complicated to people when you try to explain campaign finance and you try to explain contributions to candidates and contributions to sitting senators and congressmen. It's complicated, and there's so many different things to think about when you're discussing this, that to a person who's on the outside, well, how do you fix this? Well, what are the laws now? Well, how did it get that way? Well, how about make it so they can't give them money? Yeah. And there's all these like real simplistic views of it from the outside. But it seems that it, at the very least, limiting the amount of money that someone's allowed. Like, what is the maximum amount of money someone can give to a candidate?
Right now, in the primary and the general, it's $5,400, $2,700 in each. And that goes up according to inflation. And that's pretty small potatoes compared to what the super PACs are doing in the election. So you have these people running who expect they're going to raise the money to run their office from their direct contributions. But they're counting on the super PACs to come in and spend ungodly amounts of money, like tens of millions of dollars, to support their candidate or to oppose their opponent. And so the supporters for those super PACs are an even tiny, those are the Adolfs in America, the people named Adolf, this tiny, tiny, tiny number of people who are contributing to those things. But you're right. People, look, there's no reason why most Americans should understand the complexities of campaign finance law, and they don't need to. What they need to ask is, do we have they can corrupt the government? Then you know that they will use that power to protect themselves against innovation. Because if an innovator comes, he doesn't come with 50 lobbyists. He just comes with a great idea. I mean, Elon Musk saw this dramatically as he's developing this incredible alternative. and tried to figure out how to sell it inside of states. And then the lobbyists for the car companies would go state by state and forbid them from being able to sell cars without a local dealership in the state, right? There was a huge fight as the incumbent industries leveraged their power over government to protect themselves from this new competitor. And this is the fight we have to make central again, because if we don't do that, then the dinosaurs will have the power through this corrupted political system to protect themselves against the future. And this is just the moment when we need to figure out how to make the future come.
I'm glad you're raising these warning flags, but I feel like from talking to you that you're fairly optimistic.
You're the first person who's ever said that about
Really?
me. Yes.
I feel like you're optimistic. Your perception of the internet and the young people coming up and
that's fair.
The way information is being distributed today, that there's so many people participating in it, and there's so much competition even in that form, right? I mean, there's more voices now, and there's a lot of, look, in the past when you had to be selected in order to speak, it was very difficult to get through that selection process, and it's not necessarily the best voices that got through. It's just sometimes the most persistent and the most influential, whatever the reason why they got to be one of those people with the tie in that block on those panel shows. That's not the case anymore.
Right.
You know, now you've got Kyle Kalinske, you've got all these, you know, these people that are, they don't necessarily fit in, you know, any traditional, Jimmy Dore, they don't fit in any traditional role on regular mainstream television, but they have a pretty influential voice.
Absolutely.
And they're very politically savvy, and they're talking about things in a way that it would be very hard to get a producer to sign off on the way a lot of these guys communicate and some of the things that they do. It would be very, very difficult. But
so you're optimistic too?
I'm very optimistic.
Okay, so I'm optimistic in that space. I guess, you know, everything outside of the Beltway of Washington, I'm optimistic about. I think America, you know, has an incredible capacity to innovate out of its problems. What I fear, and what I'm not sure any rational person should be optimistic about, but, you know, that doesn't mean you don't fight it. What I fear is Washington. And so I've said many times that, like, the power of corruption in Washington might be so great that it cannot be defeated. But that doesn't affect what we should be doing. We should be fighting it whether or not we think we can win. Like, winning is not the only reason you fight. You fight because it's the right thing to do. And we need to rally because we might be wrong. It could just be that if we got the political force, we could take them down. And I think that's what we got to be setting up for right now.
When you see people like Tulsi Gabbard, or when you see the young woman in New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that, to me, that's very promising. That people are leaning iris scanners that you have on the. I have a Samsung Note 9 that has an iris scanner, checks my eyeballs. You know, my iPhone checks my face. It checks I mean, they're pretty amazing. Fingerprints, obviously. But the fact that this is probably, in terms of our own personal, like, security in terms of information, this is probably the most secure, our smartphones are probably the most secure devices we've ever possessed.
So, on the one hand, yes. And that's why I say I agree with you that in the long run we should imagine a world where it'd be trivially easy to vote, just like it's easy for me to Venmo you or Cash App you, I guess is your favorite here. Money. That should be the way the future is. But on the other hand, we need to realize that these technologies are also incredibly insecure in the sense that there is now a commercial market to exploit insecurities inside of these phones. And, you know, these companies basically have bounties that they post on the web for people who will come forward and find certain holes and hacks. And once they get those hacks, they use them to leverage power. And the government, we turn to these proprietary providers of technology to enable us to vote, they give us shit. You know, look at these voting machines. There was this recent story about this 11-year-old who was able to, within like 15 minutes, hack into the Florida election system and change the results from, you know, one candidate to another. Because the companies that build these technologies are not filled with a bunch of rocket scientists. Like, if you're really good, you're going to go work for Google or for Facebook or something like that. So the proprietary software has all of these bugs and holes and intended backdoors built into it.
Intended backdoors.
Yeah, because they need, the company itself needs a simple way to get in, to check, or to fix things. But then they don't worry about the fact that